What if the worst nightmare of your life comes true? Would you be able to survive it? This isn't just a story, it's a warning. Do you dare to listen? It was a cold, quiet night during winter break, and I was alone in the house. My parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving me to fend for myself. I didn't mind. I liked the solitude. I was curled up on the couch in the den, a small room at the back of the house with large windows that looked out into the backyard. The blinds were drawn, and the only light came from the flickering glow of the TV. I was wrapped in a thick blanket, halfway through some forgettable movie, when I heard it. A sharp click from outside. I froze. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of the motion-activated floodlight turning on. My heart skipped a beat. The backyard was fenced in, and there shouldn't have been anything out there. No animals, no people, nothing. I muted the TV and listened, straining to hear any movement. The house was silent, but the faint hum of the floodlight buzzed through the walls. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat. Maybe the wind had knocked something over, but the rational part of my brain wasn't winning this time. I stood up, my blanket falling to the floor, and crept to the window. I lifted the edge of the blind just enough to peek outside. The backyard was bathed in the harsh, white light of the floodlight. At first I saw nothing, just the empty patio and the dark outline of the trees beyond the fence. But then something moved. A shadow, quick and low to the ground, darted across the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was too big to be a cat, too fast to be a raccoon. I let the blind fall back into place and stepped away from the window. My mind raced. Should I call someone? My parents? The police? But what would I say? I think there's something in my backyard? It sounded ridiculous. I decided to wait. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just spooking myself. I sat back down on the couch, but I couldn't focus on the movie anymore. My eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting the blinds to move on their own. Then I heard it again, a loud thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. The floodlight was still on, casting a faint glow through the cracks in the blinds. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to know. I crept back to the window and lifted the blind again. This time I saw it. A figure. A person. They were standing at the far edge of the patio, just outside the circle of light. They were tall, with their arms hanging limply at their sides. I couldn't see their face. They were too far away, and the shadows were too deep, but I could feel them staring at me. My stomach dropped. I let the blind fall and backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The operator answered, and I stammered out an explanation. Someone was in my backyard. I didn't know who they were. I was alone. The operator told me to stay on the line and find a safe place to hide. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to the hallway closet and shut myself inside, crouching behind a stack of old blankets. I could hear the operator's voice through the phone, calm and reassuring, but I couldn't focus on what they were saying. My ears were tuned to the sounds coming from the den. The floodlight was still on, and I could hear faint footsteps on the patio. Then a knock, soft at first, but growing louder. They were knocking on the window. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed the phone to my ear, whispering, "They're here. They're at the window." The operator told me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I nodded even though they couldn't see me. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the sound of glass breaking. I stifled a scream. They were inside. I could hear them moving through the den, their footsteps slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The closet door was flimsy. It wouldn't take much to break it down. I clutched my phone like a lifeline, waiting for the operator to tell me the police were almost here. Then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, muttering something I couldn't understand. It was coming from just outside the closet. I pressed myself further into the corner, tears streaming down my face. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from the front of the house. The police. I heard shouting, the sound of heavy boots on the hardwood floor. The voice outside the closet stopped, and I heard the figure retreating, their footsteps fading into the distance. I stayed in the closet until an officer opened the door and helped me out. I own a small cabin in the rural part of Vermont, tucked away in the woods with only a few neighbors scattered along the winding dirt road. It's my escape, especially during the winter months when I go up to ski. The cabin sits on a large property, surrounded by dense forest on three sides, and a single neighbor to the east, separated by a rusty old fence. I've never spoken to that neighbor, never even seen them, honestly. The only person I've met is an older man named Tom, who lives further down the road. He's friendly, always waves when he drives by, and we've chatted a few times at the ski lodge. This past January, I arrived at the cabin for the first time that season. The drive was long, and the snow was coming down hard by the time I pulled into the driveway. As I stepped out of the car, I heard something that made me pause. A child's laughter, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the neighbor's property. I shrugged it off, figuring they had kids visiting. I hadn't seen any before, but it wasn't impossible. The cabin was cold and silent when I stepped inside, the way it always is after sitting empty for months. I turned on the heat, started the water, and unpacked my things. That first night, I slept like a rock, exhausted from the drive. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to hit the slopes. As I stepped outside to load my gear into the car, I noticed something odd, a bright yellow sled sitting in the middle of my front yard. It hadn't been there the day before. I figured it belonged to the neighbor's kids, so I picked it up and tossed it over the fence into their yard. No big deal. I spent the day skiing with friends, laughing and enjoying the fresh powder. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was dark, and I was ready to crash. But as I walked up to the front door, I froze. The sled was back, sitting in the exact same spot in the snow. My stomach twisted. I told myself it was just a prank. Maybe the neighbor's kids were messing with me. I tossed the sled back over the fence and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night I woke up to the sound of laughter. It was faint, but it was there. A child's laughter, echoing through the trees. I glanced at the clock. 2:47 a.m. My heart started to race. I got out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The yard was empty, but the laughter stopped as soon as I looked outside. That's when I saw it, the sled sitting in the snow again. I grabbed my coat and boots and went outside, my breath visible in the freezing air. The sled was there, just like before. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and brought it inside this time. I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I left it by the front door and went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself to the neighbor. I walked over to their house and knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, her face wrinkled but kind. I asked her about the sled and the laughter, and she looked at me like I was crazy. "There aren't any children here," she said. "Just me and my husband. We've lived here for 30 years and we've never had kids." I thanked her and went back to the cabin, my mind racing. The sled was still by the front door where I'd left it. I decided to ignore it for the day and went skiing again. When I got back that night, I was exhausted and ready to leave the next morning. I threw my gear on the couch and crashed into bed, not bothering to pack. But I woke up again to the sound of laughter. This time it was louder, closer. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. The sled was back in the yard, and this time I saw something else. A figure, small and shadowy, standing at the edge of the trees. It was too dark to make out details, but I could tell it was a child, just standing there, staring at the cabin. I ran to the front door and checked the sled I'd brought inside. It was gone. My heart pounded as I locked every door and window, turning on all the lights. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't feel alone. I packed my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking, and loaded the car. I didn't look back as I drove away, the sled still sitting in the yard. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I can't explain how the sled kept reappearing, or who or what was leaving it there. But the laughter still haunts me, and the image of that shadowy figure standing in the snow is burned into my mind. The scariest part isn't the sled or the laughter. It's the fact that whatever was out there got inside my house, and I have no idea how. My roommate Claire and I moved into this house about a year ago. It's a quiet neighborhood, just a short drive from the office where we both work. We carpool together most days, and everything had been pretty normal until 2 weeks ago when the new neighbor moved in. We never saw them unpacking. No moving trucks, no boxes, Nothing. The first sign that someone had moved in was the car parked in the driveway, a beat-up sedan with tinted windows. We didn't even know if it was a man or a woman or how many people lived there, but we decided to introduce ourselves anyway. On the third day, Claire and I walked over to the house and knocked on the door. No answer. We could hear faint noises inside, like someone shuffling around, but no one came to the door. As we turned to leave, Claire grabbed my arm and whispered, "Look." She pointed to the window next to the door. The blinds were slightly parted, and I could see a pair of eyes staring out at us. Just staring, not moving, not blinking. We hurried back to our house, both of us feeling uneasy. That night, around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of banging. It was coming from the neighbor's backyard. I got up and looked out my bedroom window, which overlooks their yard. There he was, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a hoodie with the hood up, even though it was warm outside. He was hammering something, but I couldn't tell what. The noise was relentless, and it was keeping Claire and me awake. Claire came to my room, already annoyed. "What is he doing?" she hissed. We decided to go over and ask him to stop. We knocked on the gate to his backyard, and the hammering stopped immediately. But no one came to the gate. We waited for a few minutes, but nothing happened. At least the noise had stopped, so we went back to bed. A few nights later, I woke up to screaming. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice coming from the neighbor's house. I ran to the window and saw the man in the backyard again. This time, he was dragging something, a large, heavy-looking bag. He stopped suddenly and looked up at my window. I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding. I ran to Claire's room, and she was already awake, her phone in her hand. "Call the police," I said. She nodded and dialed 911. As she was talking to the dispatcher, we heard a loud bang from downstairs. It sounded like the back door being forced open. Claire's eyes widened, and she whispered into the phone, "He's in our house. Send help now." We barricaded ourselves in Claire's room, pushing her dresser against the door. We could hear footsteps downstairs, then on the stairs. The man was coming up. He tried the door, pushing against it with all his weight. Then he started hitting it with something. A hammer, maybe. Claire and I pushed back, our hearts racing. He couldn't get in, but he didn't stop trying. Finally, we heard a shout from downstairs. "Police! Hands where I can see them!" The banging on the door stopped, and we heard footsteps retreating. Claire and I stayed in the room until the police knocked on the door and told us it was safe to come out. The man was in handcuffs, sitting on the floor in our living room. The police searched his house and found a woman locked in the basement. She was hysterical, crying and screaming that he'd kidnapped her. They also found the bag he'd been dragging. It contained the body of another woman. We didn't stick around to hear the details. The police took him away, and we haven't seen him since. The house next door is empty again, and Claire and I are just hoping someone normal moves in. But every time I hear a noise outside, I can't help but think about that night, and the man who stared up at my window with those cold, empty eyes.